Poor mom tries to get Christmas gift for her daughter, but lacks $10 until a rich boy walks in. He lived on the edge of the village, close to a thick forest where the air smelled of pine and earth. Unlike the other villagers, he had no interest in modern comforts or social approval. While others built cozy homes and filled them with gadgets, Arjun chose something very different, something that would shock anyone who tried to understand him. He decided to live in a tree. The tree was an old, enormous oak, its trunk wide and hollow in some places. Its branches stretched far into the sky, and during winter, frost would sparkle on its leaves like diamonds. Most people thought he was insane. Why would anyone live in a tree in the freezing cold? They asked each other in hushed whispers, but Arjun didn't answer anyone. He simply climbed into his tree every evening, carrying a small bundle of belongings with him, some blankets, a few utensils, a notebook, and a tiny stove that he used to cook simple meals. At first, the villagers only noticed him from a distance. Children would run past and giggle as they saw him climbing the tree like a wild animal. Some adults, shaking their heads, muttered about his foolishness. They couldn't understand why he chose to live like this, especially during the bitterly cold winter months. The snow came early that year and the winds were sharper than ever. Yet, Arjun climbed his tree without hesitation, as if the cold didn't touch him. He had not always been like this. Once, he had lived in a small house at the center of the town. He had neighbors, friends, and even a family, but life had taught him that people often valued appearances over truth. The house he lived in became a place of gossip, competition, and constant judgment. No one noticed his hard work or his kindness. So one day he left everything behind and walked toward the forest. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, nor did he expect anyone to understand. The tree became his home, his sanctuary, and the place where he could finally breathe freely. Living in a tree in the freezing cold was not easy. Each day he had to gather firewood from the nearby forest, often trudging through snow with numb fingers. The winds howled at night, rattling the branches, and sometimes the frost made it impossible to move without slipping. But Arjun had prepared himself. He wrapped himself in layers of old blankets, tied ropes to secure himself to the tree, and learned to sleep in a way that kept him warm. His neighbors, however, saw this from a distance and only laughed or shook their heads. Even when people tried to help, he politely refused. One morning, a kind woman left a basket of food at the base of the tree, hoping he would take it. Arjun thanked her quietly but did not touch it. He had enough supplies of his own. His life was simple, and simplicity was something he valued above all else. He did not need people's charity, nor did he seek approval. To him, living this way was freedom. It was his choice, and he had made it firmly. The children, however, were the most curious. They would sneak into the forest after school just to watch him. They giggled when they saw him cooking tiny meals on his small stove, or when he climbed down to gather water from a nearby stream. One day, a child asked him, "Why do you live in a tree when it is so cold?" Arjun smiled softly, brushing the snow off his coat. "Because this is where I feel alive," he said simply. The child did not understand, but the words stayed with him. Arjun spent most of his days in quiet reflection. He wrote in his small notebook about the world, about the people, and about nature. He noticed the small things, the way the snow melted on the leaves, how birds built their nests in winter, and how the forest seemed to breathe around him. He observed life in a way that no one else in the town did. While others rushed to work or sat in their warm homes complaining about the cold, Arjun lived fully in the moment, learning lessons that the villagers could not see. Sometimes, the nights were the hardest. The cold crept into every corner of the tree, and hunger made his stomach ache. But Arjun never gave up. He had developed ways to survive that were simple but effective. He stored dry leaves and small branches to use as insulation. He collected rainwater when possible and melted snow over his small stove for drinking. He learned to move quietly, to listen to the wind and the sounds of the forest, and to anticipate storms before they arrived. It was a life of struggle, but it was also a life of mastery. The villagers continued to mock him, unaware of his inner strength. They would tell stories to their children, calling him crazy and foolish. "He lives in a tree like an animal," they said, yet Arjun never let these words affect him. He had built a world where the opinions of others did not matter. To him, freedom was worth more than comfort, and survival was a form of self-respect. Despite the harsh conditions, Arjun's life in the tree was not lonely. Birds often perched near him, and squirrels would curiously peek at his tiny kitchen. He greeted each day with a calm smile, knowing that even in the coldest winters, life carried lessons to teach. He had once depended on the world for approval, but now he depended only on himself and nature. The villagers could not see it, but he had found happiness in simplicity, in silence, and in living a life on his own terms. One morning, after a particularly cold night, the children came closer than usual. They watched him carefully gather snow and melt it into water. One of them whispered, "He is not like us." Another replied, "Maybe he is stronger than us." Arjun heard nothing and continued his work, but inside he felt a quiet satisfaction. He knew that strength was not about muscles or wealth. It was about patience, courage, and resilience. Weeks passed and winter deepened. The villagers' mockery grew louder, but so did their curiosity. Some even tried to imitate him for a short while, climbing small trees or trying to survive the cold as he did. Most failed quickly and returned home shivering. Arjun, however, thrived. His careful preparation, his knowledge of the forest, and his unwavering spirit made him capable of enduring what others could not. Arjun's tree became more than just a shelter, it became a symbol. To him, it was proof that a person could survive without following the rules of society, that one could find freedom in the smallest spaces, and that happiness could come from living authentically. While others worried about appearances, he worried about learning, growing, and living fully. As the first snowstorm of the season approached, Arjun prepared like he had for years. He collected extra firewood, secured his rope lines, and stored more blankets in the hollow of the tree. While villagers stayed in their warm homes, complaining about the storm, Arjun smiled softly, feeling a quiet connection to the winter around him. The storm was not a danger to him, it was a test, a reminder of the strength he had built over time. By the end of the month, the villagers began to notice something strange. Despite the bitter cold, Arjun was alive, strong, and seemingly unaffected. Some whispered to each other, "How is he still alive?" Children, who once laughed at him, began to watch him with quiet respect. Even the adults, while still skeptical, could not ignore that he had survived where others would have given up. Yet Arjun never boasted about his survival. He never called attention to his courage. Instead, he continued his quiet, simple life, focusing on small acts of daily survival and reflection. His life, though harsh and challenging, was full of purpose. He had chosen a path that few understood, and he walked it with dignity and patience. Through it all, Arjun taught an unspoken lesson. Happiness and strength do not come from comfort, wealth, or approval. They come from understanding oneself, respecting nature, and building resilience. He had traded the warmth of a home for the freedom of a tree, and in doing so, had discovered a life that few could imagine. By the end of winter, the villagers had begun to change the way they saw him, though none admitted it openly. Children no longer mocked him. Some adults left small gifts of food at the base of his tree, quietly acknowledging his determination. Arjun continued to live in the tree, undisturbed by recognition or praise, for he understood that his life was his own and that his strength was not for others to measure. It was for himself. And so, the man who had been mocked for living in a tree in freezing cold had already begun to plant the seeds of respect, even without realizing it. His quiet courage, patience, and self-reliance would eventually become the story everyone in the village could not ignore, a story that would teach them more than mockery ever could. The winter grew harsher with each passing day. Snow fell heavily, covering the forest and the village alike in a thick white blanket. The winds howled through the trees like restless spirits, rattling branches and sweeping away everything that wasn't tightly secured. Most villagers stayed inside their warm homes, peering through frosted windows, complaining about the cold. They could not imagine choosing to live outside in such weather, let alone in a tree. But for Arjun, this was simply life, challenging, yes, but also alive with lessons and discovery. Each morning he would wake before the sun rose, the chill in the air biting at his fingers and toes. He carefully unwrapped himself from his blankets, feeling the icy air press against his face. The hollow of the tree provided some shelter, but it did not stop the cold from seeping in. Every movement was a challenge. Even climbing down a few branches to fetch water from the nearby stream left him shivering. Yet he moved with calm determination, as though the cold was just another obstacle to navigate, not a punishment. Arjun's days were filled with survival tasks that required focus, patience, and skill. He chopped small branches for firewood, carefully avoiding the heavier snow-laden limbs that could snap under pressure. Each piece of wood was precious, and the fire he built each morning became both warmth and life itself. He melted snow into water and rationed it carefully, knowing that supplies were limited. Meals were simple: roots, dried grains he had stored, and occasionally vegetables he could find in the forest. He cooked slowly, making sure the flames stayed steady, knowing that even a small fire could be life-saving in such cold conditions. Despite the hard labor, Arjun never complained. The cold, the hunger, the isolation, all were simply parts of the life he had chosen. He often watched the snow fall through the branches, the forest seeming almost magical in its quiet whiteness. He marveled at the way frost coated each twig, how small animals moved cautiously through the snow, and how birds fluffed their feathers to survive the biting air. To Arjun, each day was a lesson in patience, observation, and resilience. He recorded these observations in his notebook, sometimes drawing sketches of the birds or noting how the wind shifted during storms. The villagers, meanwhile, continued to gossip. They could not believe he had survived so long in such conditions. "He must be suffering," they said. "No one can live like that without losing their mind." Children still whispered and pointed when they saw him, but some began to watch silently, unable to tear their eyes away from the man who seemed unshakable even in the fiercest cold. Occasionally, a brave soul would leave a small bundle of food or a blanket at the base of his tree. Arjun would thank them quietly, but often did not use the gifts, preferring to rely on his own preparations. Winter was not just cold, it was unpredictable. Storms could appear suddenly, whipping the forest into chaos. One afternoon, as Arjun climbed down to collect water, the wind suddenly shifted. Snow stung his face and the branches swayed violently. He knew a storm was coming. Quickly, he tied himself securely to the tree, gathering his blankets and firewood. He secured his small stove and wrapped himself in layers. The storm hit with full force by evening, gusts rattling the tree and sending snow flying in all directions. Arjun sat calmly in the hollow, feeling the wind but not panicking. He had faced storms before and knew that surviving meant preparation, focus, and patience. Nighttime was even harder. The temperature dropped to levels that would make most people shiver uncontrollably. Arjun huddled in his blankets, using every trick he had learned over the years to keep warm. He would place dry leaves around his sleeping area, layer his clothing carefully, and sometimes even hug himself for extra warmth. Hunger often accompanied the cold, gnawing at his stomach, but he never let it weaken his spirit. He knew that endurance was as much mental as it was physical. The forest itself became a strange companion. Arjun noticed small details that others ignored: footprints of animals in the snow, frozen droplets on leaves that glimmered in the faint light, the quiet songs of birds who still braved the cold. Sometimes he would speak softly to the forest, thanking it for keeping him alive. Though he lived alone, he never felt lonely. He found connection in observing life around him, in the rhythm of the seasons, and in the quiet strength it took to survive each day. One day, a particularly bitter cold wind swept through the forest. Arjun had to climb down to repair a small tear in his blanket that protected him from drafts. The snow was deep, reaching up to his knees. Each step required careful attention, as one wrong movement could send him slipping into the icy ground. Yet he moved with skill and patience, reaching the base of the tree safely and making the necessary repairs. The villagers who saw him from afar shook their heads. "No one could survive that long in such cold," they whispered, but Arjun did not listen. His mind was focused on the present task, the life he was living fully, and the warmth he would create for the night. Even during the harshest days, Arjun's mind remained sharp. He planned ahead, storing extra firewood, thinking about how he would move during storms, and keeping his small supplies rationed. He had developed a routine that balanced physical survival with mental calmness. Meditation, journaling, and observation of nature became as vital to him as food and warmth. Each day he spent alone reinforced his strength, patience, and self-discipline. Despite his calm exterior, the struggle was real. There were moments when hunger made his stomach ache fiercely, or when the cold seemed unbearable. Yet, he had learned not to fight against these feelings, but to endure them. He understood that complaining would not change the wind, the snow, or the cold. it would only weaken him. Survival required acceptance of the situation, careful preparation, and resilience of both body and mind. Children still came to watch him, now with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. They noticed how he moved efficiently through the snow, how he maintained his fire, and how he seemed completely at peace even when the storm raged around him. Some tried to climb the tree like him, but most quickly gave up, slipping and returning home with cold hands and wet clothes. Arjun watched quietly, sometimes offering advice, sometimes simply smiling. He did not scold or mock. He knew that the lessons of patience and resilience could only be learned through experience. The villagers began to notice another change. While they still whispered about him, there was a growing sense of respect. They saw a man who had survived where others would have perished. They began to wonder what had kept him alive, what strength he possessed that allowed him to endure the worst that winter could throw. Slowly, some began to leave small gifts, not to mock or pity, but out of genuine admiration. Arjun accepted these silently, though he never depended on them. His strength remained his own. As the month passed, the snow deepened and the cold grew sharper. Arjun faced challenges that tested him in ways he had never imagined. One evening, he spotted a group of deer trapped in deep snow near the forest edge. Without hesitation, he carefully approached, knowing that any wrong movement could alert them or put him at risk. He helped guide them to a safer area, breaking a trail through the snow and leading them to shelter. This act went unnoticed by the villagers, but it was another example of his quiet courage and connection to the natural world. At night, he often reflected on his choice to live in the tree. He thought about the warmth of his old home, the comfort of being surrounded by people who cared, and the ease of modern life. Yet, he never regretted his decision. The struggle, the cold, the isolation, they had taught him more than comfort ever could. Each day spent in hardship strengthened his body, sharpened his mind, and deepened his understanding of life. Sometimes, the cold brought moments of danger. On one occasion, a branch he relied on for support cracked under the weight of ice. He fell slightly but managed to catch himself, clutching the trunk and steadying his balance. His heart raced, but he remained calm. Accidents could happen, he knew, but fear would not save him. Skill, attention, and calmness would. He spent hours that night reinforcing his tree, securing weak branches, and ensuring that he could survive any future storm. The villagers continued to watch from afar, whispering and shaking their heads. Yet they could no longer deny that Arjun was different. There was a quiet strength in him, a mastery over hardship that most had never seen. Even in freezing cold, he moved gracefully, survived steadily, and faced each challenge with patience. The mocking tone of the village slowly faded into curiosity, and curiosity began to turn into respect. Arjun's life in the tree became a story of endurance and wisdom. He had chosen hardship, yes, but in return he had gained freedom, clarity, and self-reliance. Every morning, as the frost sparkled on the branches and the forest glistened under the pale sunlight, he would smile softly. He was alive. He was strong. And he had learned the quiet power of patience, preparation, and inner strength. By the end of the second month, even the coldest days could not shake him. The villagers had begun to speak of him differently, whispering that he might know secrets of survival they could never imagine. Children began to emulate his calmness. Adults started leaving small notes of encouragement, and some even wondered if they, too, could learn from him. Yet Arjun remained focused on living each day fully, respecting the forest and surviving with dignity. Even in struggle, there was beauty. The snow-covered branches, the quiet hum of the wind, the sparkle of frost in the morning sun, all reminded Arjun that life, even when harsh, carried wonder. He had chosen a life that others mocked, but he had found lessons, wisdom, and peace that few in the village could ever hope to understand. And so, Arjun faced winter not as a victim of the cold, but as a man who had learned to thrive within it. The struggle continued. The snow deepened and the wind howled, but he remained strong, patient, and observant. In the quiet of the forest, in the hollow of his tree, he had found not only survival but a profound understanding of life, resilience, and the quiet strength that comes from enduring what others fear. The winter had reached its peak, and the village was buried under a thick blanket of snow. The winds blew with a force that rattled even the sturdiest of houses, and the forest seemed almost frozen in time, silent except for the occasional creaking of heavy branches. Most villagers stayed indoors, wrapped in thick blankets, afraid to venture outside for fear of frostbite or injury. Yet in the hollow of his tree, Arjun moved calmly, as he always had. To him, the storm was another test of patience and skill, a challenge to overcome rather than a danger to fear. The forest was harsh and unforgiving, but Arjun had grown used to its rhythms. He knew which paths were safe to traverse, which branches could hold his weight, and how to read the signs of an approaching storm. His small stove provided warmth, and his firewood supply, carefully rationed, was enough to survive the longest nights. Every day he checked his supplies, reinforced his tree, and observed the forest for any signs of trouble. Living alone in such conditions had taught him vigilance and foresight, qualities that others rarely practiced. One morning, as the sun barely broke through the thick clouds, Arjun noticed something unusual. A small figure was moving through the snow at the edge of the forest. At first he thought it was a deer, but as he watched more closely, he realized it was a child, a little boy from the village. The child had wandered too far in the snow and appeared lost and scared. His small arms flailed, and he stumbled repeatedly, sinking into the deep snow with every step. Arjun's heart pounded, not with fear for himself, but with concern for the child. He knew that if help did not arrive quickly, the boy could freeze in the harsh winter. Without hesitation, Arjun wrapped himself in extra blankets and tied a sturdy rope around his waist. Carefully, he climbed down the tree, moving with precision over the slippery branches and snow-covered ground. The wind howled around him, cutting into his face and hands, but he did not falter. Each step was calculated, every movement deliberate. He approached the child slowly, calling out softly so as not to startle him. "It's okay, little one. I will help you," he said, his voice steady and calm. The child looked up, tears streaming down his cheeks, and froze at the sight of the man. He had heard stories from the other villagers about Arjun, the man who lived in the tree, but had never imagined meeting him face to face. His fear was mixed with curiosity. Arjun knelt in the snow, careful not to frighten him further, and gently held out his hand. "Take my hand," he said softly. The child hesitated for a moment, then clutched Arjun's hand, shivering uncontrollably. The journey back to the village was perilous. The snow was deep and the wind was merciless. Arjun wrapped the child in his extra blanket, keeping him close to preserve warmth. He led the way, breaking a trail through the snow, carefully choosing each step to avoid hidden ice or weak branches. The child's small body trembled, but he slowly began to trust the man guiding him. Arjun spoke quietly, pointing out signs of the forest and telling the boy to move slowly, to keep his balance, and to hold on tightly. Meanwhile, villagers who had peeked outside saw the strange sight. A man living in a tree was carrying a child through the snow with ease and calm. They rubbed their eyes, certain they must be seeing things wrong. Children who had laughed at Arjun just days before stood frozen, their mouths slightly open in disbelief. The adults murmured in shock. No one had expected that the man they mocked would be capable of such courage and skill. Some even whispered that he might have a special connection with nature, though they could not explain why. Arjun's steps were slow but deliberate. The snow reached his knees in some places, but he never stumbled. He had prepared for conditions like this, and his experience living in the forest allowed him to navigate safely. The child clung to him tightly, exhausted and terrified, but he felt a strange sense of security. In the presence of Arjun, the fear of the storm seemed to diminish. The man's calm determination and knowledge of survival inspired trust, even in someone so young. After what felt like hours, they finally reached the edge of the village. The warmth of human habitations, faint smoke from chimneys, and the distant sound of bells signaling the time were almost overwhelming compared to the harsh silence of the forest. Villagers rushed forward, their mouths open in shock and admiration. "It's him." "It's Arjun," someone shouted. Mothers clutched their children, and fathers nodded respectfully, realizing that the man they had mocked was the very person who had saved a life when others could not. The child was safely handed over to his parents, who wrapped him in warm blankets and hugged him tightly. Tears of relief ran down their faces. Who saved you?" one parent asked, looking at the man standing quietly in the snow. Arjun simply smiled and nodded, saying nothing. The villagers, still frozen with awe, slowly approached. Some children hesitated, then ran forward to touch his hand, wanting to feel the courage that had saved their friend. Adults offered words of gratitude, though some struggled to speak, their previous mockery now replaced by respect. For Arjun, this was not a moment of pride. He had not acted for recognition or thanks. He had acted because it was the right thing to do. Yet he could not ignore the astonished faces surrounding him. He realized that the villagers' perception of him was changing, though he remained humble, keeping his distance and his quiet dignity. The storm continued, but in that moment, the warmth of human gratitude reached him in a way that even the harshest winter could not diminish. In the days that followed, the story spread like wildfire through the village. Neighbors who had mocked him before now spoke in hushed tones about his bravery. Children who had once laughed at his unusual lifestyle now told each other stories of his courage, describing how he had navigated the forest, braved the storm, and rescued a child without hesitation. Even the adults began to see him differently. They marveled at his knowledge, his patience, and his extraordinary calm in the face of danger. Arjun's life in the tree became more than a personal choice. It became a lesson for the entire village. People began to reflect on their own fears and limitations. If a man could live alone in a tree during the harshest winter and still emerge strong and capable, what did that say about the strength and courage within themselves? Slowly, admiration replaced mockery. Even the children who had pointed and laughed before now asked questions about survival, nature, and courage, wanting to learn from the man who had lived in a tree. Despite the newfound respect, Arjun remained unchanged. He continued his daily routines, climbing his tree, tending to his fire, and observing the forest. He helped those who asked for guidance, teaching children how to survive in the cold, how to read the forest, and how to remain calm during storms. He spoke gently, never with judgment or pride, sharing the lessons he had learned through years of solitude and endurance. His humility made the villagers respect him even more. Arjun's rescue of the child became a turning point, not just for the villagers, but for himself. He realized that living in solitude did not mean disconnecting from humanity. He could maintain his independence and freedom while also helping others when needed. The respect he had earned was not the goal, but a natural result of living authentically, with courage, patience, and compassion. Over time, the villagers began to notice other acts of quiet heroism. He would guide lost animals, clear paths in the snow for those who dared venture out, and even warn travelers of hidden dangers in the forest. Each act reinforced the lesson that strength was not measured by wealth or status, but by courage, resilience, and willingness to act when it mattered most. The man they once mocked for living in a tree had become a symbol of hope and bravery in the harshest of winters. The child he had saved visited him often after the storm had passed. He would sit quietly by the fire, listening to Arjun's stories of survival, nature, and the forest. Slowly, he learned to respect and admire the man who had faced the storm with such calmness. Other children, inspired by the story, began to observe Arjun more closely, noticing the careful way he moved, the patience he exhibited, and the strength he carried in both body and mind. Arjun, however, never asked for recognition or reward. He continued to live simply, quietly, and with purpose. The tree remained his home and the forest his companion. Yet he had changed in one subtle way. He now understood the value of connecting with others, of sharing wisdom, and of demonstrating courage in action. The villagers, too, had changed. Their perception of him, once filled with ridicule, was now full of respect and curiosity. They saw that even the most unusual choices could carry wisdom and strength beyond their understanding. By the end of the storm, the village had experienced a subtle transformation. Where mockery had once existed, admiration now bloomed. Where fear of the cold had dominated, inspiration had taken its place. And where people had doubted the man in the tree, they now realized that he had qualities they could learn from: courage, patience, resilience, and a profound understanding of life's challenges. Even after the crisis had passed, Arjun's presence in the tree continued to inspire. Children visited to learn survival skills, adults occasionally sought advice, and the village quietly accepted that his way of life, however strange, held lessons they could not ignore. The man who had once been mocked had quietly proven that true strength comes not from wealth, comfort, or approval, but from courage, preparation, and the ability to face challenges with calmness and determination. Winter slowly began to fade, and the harsh winds that had rattled. The village for months grew softer. Snow still blanketed the ground, but the air carried a hint of warmth that promised the arrival of spring. The villagers, who had once mocked Arjun for living in a tree during the coldest months, now regarded him with quiet respect. His courage, patience, and resilience had left a mark on their hearts, and the story of the child he saved during the snowstorm had spread far and wide. Arjun remained in his tree, as he always had. The hollow of the old oak, lined with layers of blankets and dry leaves, had become a sanctuary for him, not just from the cold, but from the distractions and judgments of the world. Yet he had begun to notice subtle changes in the villagers' behavior. Children who had once pointed and laughed now approached him with curiosity, asking questions about the forest, the animals, and how he survived through the harshest winter. Adults, too, had begun to visit him, sometimes quietly observing, other times seeking guidance on survival or courage. It was a strange experience for Arjun. He had lived alone for so long, valuing solitude and the quiet rhythm of nature, yet now he found himself slowly connecting with the community. He realized that respect and understanding were not things he sought. They were things that came naturally when one lived authentically and with courage. Still, he did not change his ways. He continued his simple routine, gathering firewood, tending his small stove, and observing the forest. But now there was a new presence in his life, the presence of others who had begun to recognize the wisdom in his choices. One morning, as the sun rose softly over the snow-covered village, Arjun noticed a group of children standing at the edge of the forest. They were bundled in thick coats, scarves, and gloves, their eyes wide with wonder. They had come to learn from him, to understand how he survived the winter and navigated the forest with such calm and skill. Arjun smiled gently and invited them closer, showing them how to tie knots to secure themselves, how to observe signs in the snow, and how to carefully choose paths through icy terrain. The children listened eagerly, absorbing each lesson with awe and admiration. Adults also began seeking his guidance, though with more hesitation. Some brought questions about safety, food, and the changing seasons, while others simply came to observe his daily routines. They had once ridiculed him for his choices, but now they were learning from them. Arjun spoke quietly and patiently, never criticizing the past, only guiding them toward understanding. He emphasized the importance of patience, preparation, and observation, teaching that true strength was not measured by wealth or power, but by courage, resilience, and wisdom. The villagers' perception of him had changed completely. Where once they saw only a man living in unusual conditions, they now saw a teacher, a guide, and a symbol of courage. Mothers began telling their children about him, not as a figure of mockery, but as an example of bravery and self-reliance. Fathers who had once whispered doubts about his sanity now nodded respectfully, understanding that his life choices had required immense strength and intelligence. Even the children who had laughed at him were now among his most devoted listeners, eager to learn the lessons that winter had taught him. Arjun himself felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had chosen solitude not for selfish reasons, but because it allowed him to understand life in a deeper way. Living in the tree had taught him patience, resilience, and self-reliance. It had also taught him the importance of connection, of helping others when needed, and of leading by example. The respect he had earned from the villagers was not something he sought, but it was a confirmation that living authentically and courageously could influence others in profound ways. As spring approached, Arjun continued his simple life in the tree, but the forest seemed to change around him. Birds returned in larger numbers, snow melted to reveal soft green moss and budding flowers, and the streams flowed more freely. He observed these changes with the same quiet attention he had always shown, marveling at the resilience of life and the patterns of nature. It was a reminder that life, no matter how harsh, always carried hope, growth, and renewal. The villagers began to involve him in community matters, though he remained humble. He offered advice on safety during storms, survival techniques, and even simple methods to respect nature while harvesting resources. He never imposed himself, never sought recognition, but his presence gradually became valued. People began to leave small gifts, warm blankets, food supplies, and handmade tools at the base of his tree, not because he needed them, but as gestures of respect and gratitude. Arjun accepted them quietly, maintaining his independence, but acknowledging the goodwill behind the actions. Children continued to be fascinated by him. They would gather near his tree during the afternoons, asking questions about the animals, the forest, and the skills required to survive in the cold. Arjun taught them not just the practical skills, but also lessons in patience, observation, and mindfulness. He explained that true survival was not just about physical strength, but about mental calmness and respect for the world around them. These lessons were absorbed quietly, slowly shaping a new generation of children who would remember courage and resilience as key values. Even the adults began to change in subtle ways. Farmers who once complained about winter storms now observed how Arjun moved through the snow and maintained his fire. Merchants who had doubted his choices now sought his advice on preparedness. The village slowly shifted from a place of judgment and mockery to a place of learning and respect. Arjun had shown them that courage and wisdom often come from unexpected places, and that the choices of one individual could inspire an entire community. One day, as he sat quietly in his tree, watching the sunlight glint off the melting snow, Arjun reflected on his journey. He thought about the long, harsh months of winter, the storms he had weathered, and the moments of fear and struggle he had faced alone. He also remembered the day he had saved the child, the moment that had changed the way the villagers saw him. It was a reminder that actions, more than words, had the power to transform perceptions and teach lessons. Arjun realized that living in the tree had not been an escape from the world, but a way to prepare himself for meaningful action. His solitude had strengthened him, his patience had refined him, and his connection with nature had taught him wisdom that could now benefit others. The respect and admiration he received from the villagers were not the goal, but the natural outcome of living a life with courage, authenticity, and purpose. The village itself began to change as a result. People became more aware of the importance of resilience and preparation. Children learned to respect nature, to observe the signs of weather, and to understand that courage was often quiet and steady, not loud and boastful. Adults learned to appreciate patience, skill, and knowledge gained through experience. Arjun's presence in the tree had become a living lesson, a daily example of the power of resilience and integrity. Arjun, however, remained humble. He never flaunted his strength or wisdom. He continued his daily routines, climbing the tree, tending his fire, and observing the forest. He helped when he could, guided those who asked, and lived quietly in harmony with nature. Yet he understood the impact of his actions. Through courage, patience, and authenticity, he had changed the way his entire village thought about life, survival, and respect. As spring fully arrived, the forest around Arjun's tree flourished. Flowers bloomed, birds sang, and the snow melted into streams that glistened in the sunlight. The villagers watched in awe as Arjun continued to thrive in his tree, moving with the same calm and precision as he had in the coldest winter months. They no longer questioned his choices, no longer mocked him. Instead, they learned from him, respected him, and even sought inspiration in his life. One day, a group of villagers gathered at the edge of the forest. They brought food, tools, and blankets, not to give to Arjun out of pity, but as a gesture of respect and gratitude. They wanted to learn from him, to hear his stories, and to understand the lessons he had quietly taught during the harsh winter. Arjun welcomed them gently, sharing his knowledge with patience and humility. He showed them the ways of the forest, how to respect nature, and how to survive challenges with courage and preparation. The children listened eagerly, asking questions, absorbing each lesson with wide-eyed fascination. They learned how to tie knots, how to observe the tracks of animals, and how to move safely through the forest. But more importantly, they learned patience, observation, and quiet courage. Adults, too, observed carefully, realizing that the skills Arjun demonstrated were valuable not just for survival, but for life itself. Through this interaction, Arjun saw the village transform. The mockery of the past had faded, replaced by respect, curiosity, and admiration. People learned that courage was not loud or boastful, but steady and deliberate. They learned that strength was not measured by comfort or wealth, but by resilience, preparation, and the ability to face challenges with calmness. And they learned that wisdom often comes from observing and listening, rather than judging or mocking. Arjun continued to live in his tree, as he always had, but now with a quiet sense of fulfillment. He had survived the harshest winter, saved a life, and inspired a community. He had remained humble, patient, and true to himself. and in doing so, he had taught a lesson that would last far longer than any cold season. The village had learned that respect, courage, and resilience were values worth honoring, and that even the most unusual choices could carry wisdom and strength beyond understanding. The story of the man in the tree became a legend in the village, passed from children to parents and grandparents. It was a story not of wealth or fame, but of courage, patience, and quiet heroism. Arjun had shown that living authentically, facing challenges with determination, and helping others when needed could inspire an entire community. He had turned ridicule into respect, mockery into admiration, and solitude into wisdom. And so, the man who had once been mocked for living in a tree in freezing cold had quietly become a teacher, a guide, and a symbol of courage. His life reminded everyone that true strength comes not from appearances or approval, but from patience, resilience, and the courage to live authentically. The village had changed, the children had learned, and Arjun continued to live his life with quiet dignity, teaching lessons through his actions and showing that even the most unusual choices can carry the greatest wisdom.